Hey everybody, it is Trags, Mike Petralia back with the latest episode of the Jungle War podcast, powered by our good friends at Prize Picks, the Game Time app, and a new partner this week, Factor Meals. So welcome aboard, Factor Meals. Of course, I also want to thank the fine folks at CLNS Media for making sure we are on all of the podcast platforms every single week. My pleasure to welcome in this week Tony Pike of ESPN 360. You can hear him Monday through Friday, noon to 3 o'clock on ESPN 1530 in Cincinnati. And I don't think there is a better talk show host or a better authority in town to make observations about one Joe Burrow than Tony Pike. Tony, how you doing, bud?
I'm doing great, man. I appreciate you having me. I also appreciate that you've decided to not wear any type of Indian Hill paraphernalia today.
Thought crossed my mind.
Which makes this even better. You look so much better, without the hat on. So I'm happy to be here.
I left the Indian Hill white with red trim hat in my car. So no, I will not be wearing it during this podcast. The least I could do to appease one Tony Pike to get him on this podcast. All right. Before we talk about the 53-man cut down that happened on Tuesday, so much talk, and I think rightfully so, about how Joe Burrow looked in training camp, the one series in the preseason that we did see him. And you were there almost every single day at camp, Tony. And you, better than anybody else, knows how a quarterback should look. Mm-hmm. Maybe how, you're never going to know how he feels, obviously, but you know how a quarterback should feel. And I want to get your general observations about what you saw from Joe Burrow from the start of training camp, which was whatever it was, July 24th, up until now.
Yeah, I thought he started off camp unbelievable. I wasn't able to get down to OTAs or any of the off-season stuff. So the start of camp was the first time I had got to see Joe Burrow really since the injury last year. I had read a bunch, I had heard a bunch. But getting down there to camp late July, I was blown away at the start of camp because I'm like, man, no way this guy's coming off a major wrist injury that involves tendons and ligaments and nerve damage and scar tissue that's built up and all of this. And I thought, all things considered, without Jamar Chase, I was blown away because early on in camp, the offense was seemingly winning every single day. I'm like, man, they're doing this on some days when T. Higgins isn't doing team drills. They're doing it without Jamar Chase.
Right.
And it really caused reason for excitement to jump back in. And then I listened to Joe Burrow throughout camp talk about, it's not 100% yet. He talked about stages of rehab where you plateau a little bit and you got to kind of push through. So I thought as camp went on, I thought there were some signs of soreness and fatigue personally on my end.
To be expected. He said that to expect that. He was very upfront about that. Zach Taylor was like at the very beginning of camp saying, look, we know we're going to have to go with the ebbs and the flows of this whole process, but we're confident that Joe will be where we need him to be.
I thought there were times where, and to his own account, the ball fluttered a little bit. I thought there were times where it didn't have the finish and the zip at the very end. He checked the long distance boxes. He checked the touch throws. He checked getting the ball out quick. But you could see certain days it looked like he was uncomfortable or messing with the grip a little bit or trying to figure out this is a process. This is an injury that's really unprecedented from a quarterback standpoint. And if you want to break down the intricacies of the throw, you're using every single finger to snap the ball at the top. That's getting you the ultimate spin. So I looked at, the old Marvin Lewis, I see better than I hear. And I thought, okay, there's still a little ways to go for Joe Burrow. But what I thought was the most promising and the biggest stamp of approval for me is you mentioned Zach Taylor's beginning of camp. He said there's going to be built-in off days for Joe Burrow. He had one, which tells me there was never anything wrong structurally or worrying about injury or taking a step back. I viewed it as more, this is a normal for him. He's now trying to navigate that the wrist just doesn't feel. There's scar tissue. There's nerve endings. There's all kinds of stuff that goes on with the wrist injury. And in navigating all of that, I thought it was a phenomenal camp for Joe Burrow. Yes, there were days where he struggled. Yes, there were days where he was visibly frustrated, but I also think there's 10 different factors that go in to why a quarterback can be frustrated after a couple bad days on the practice field. So when you look at the big picture and you look at where Joe Burrow and where this offense is and where they're going, I think they're ahead of even where I expected them to be coming out of training camp. Are there new hurdles to overcome? Yes, he's going to get hit now. He's going to fall, and at some point he's going to brace his fall. He's probably going to hit his hand at some point on a helmet in the pocket. So there are still avenues that he has to overcome. But from the start of camp to where they are now, I think you feel really good about where Joe Burrow is.
So much focus, Tony, on that black glove that made an appearance over the last week and a half. And from what I've been able to gather, the issue is not that he's trying to remedy any pain or soreness with the glove, or even stimulate blood flow to quicken the healing process. The healing process is obviously still ongoing, but it's almost
which he
done.
Does the blood flow. He squeezes a lot during practice to get that blood flowing.
And to break up scar tissue. That's why we see him, roll the wrist both ways and everything. But the whole point of the grip, the way it was explained to me is that from somebody who would know inside the organization, is that glove is designed primarily to help get his grip working. Yeah. So my question is, do you think that perhaps the wrist has impacted his ability to fully grip the ball, and that is essentially what he's trying to get back?
I would think so. I mean, my career ended because of nerve damage that was permanent in my elbow that shot down to my fingers. I had no feeling by the end of it being done. I had no fingers in my pinky and ring finger. And you think, okay, throw the ball. It deals with every single thing with your release when you don't have the ability in those two fingers. So I think his on a different level. I think it's still a process for him. And I think he's trying to navigate the grip, which, again, if the ball flutters or if there's not as much zip, that's more of a grip thing than anything. No one's questioning his strength. He looks to be in the best physical shape of his life, bigger, faster, stronger, everything. You visibly see that when he takes the field. But I do still think there is navigating what's going on with the grip. And I do think that's why you saw the glove towards the end of camp. But again, I preface it with he never missed. Right, he missed the one day early in camp, and he never missed another day, which tells me there's no type of setbacks because they would have rested him, and they could have easily done that because Zach Taylor went out of his way to talk about off days at the beginning of camp. They didn't really have to bank any of those. They didn't have to use any of those. So I still don't see it as that big of an issue, because if it were, he would have probably had to miss a day or two while they tried to navigate what's next.
Your reaction when you saw the Cincinnati Bengals social media posts on Sunday afternoon of one Ja'Marr Chase on the field with not only his helmet on, but the compression cap, the concussion cap that players wear over it, meaning he was actually taking part in whatever limited practice the Bengals were doing on Sunday and Monday. He was on the field. What was your initial reaction when you saw that?
I was shocked. Because there was still no deal done, and they may be closer to a deal. And obviously the CD Lamb probably helps set what the market should be. But when I saw it, my first thought was, what has changed? Because it didn't feel like the Bengals had moved on from where they were at, and it doesn't feel like Ja'Marr Chase had gotten the deal that he wanted. So my first question was what was the hold-in for? What was the point of, outside of just not wanting to go through training camp and making sure you're protected and staying fresh? I get all that, but
maybe that is what all it was, Tony.
Maybe it is. Hey, I know that I'm due to make a lot of money, and by not going through training camp, I could still show up, collect the money I'm owed, and then make sure I get to the season healthy and not have to go through joint practices or take some of that wear and tear on the body. Maybe that's it. And maybe there is a deal close. Maybe now that, like I said, now that CD Lamb is done, maybe the market is set. And if you're the Bengals, there are paths and avenues where it makes sense to get the deal done now and not have to pay more next year when the market resets again. So I see both sides of it. I was puzzled when I saw him out there, because my first thought was, what happened? What was the point of holding in all throughout training camp, unless it was strictly to just keep himself fresher getting into the season, because all along this was the timeline for me. If it got to this week and he still wasn't out there, then it became a problem because there's just not enough build-up time ahead of the Patriots. And now I feel like you get 2 full weeks. That is enough time for Ja'Marr Chase, who I'm sure has kept himself in great shape, to get back into football shape, to get in and out of this new offensive system where there are new intricacies built in Dan Pitcher's system. Mm-hmm. I think he gave himself enough time with the lead in, and we heard it confirmed from Zach Taylor to be ready for week 1.
And it's not like he hasn't been around the team.
Right.
And that's the other thing. He's been in the meetings. He's been talking to Burrow. He's been talking to Dan Pitcher, Troy Walters, wide receivers coach. I think he'll be ready and good to go. You mentioned what Zach Taylor said on Tuesday when asked multiple times by Ben Baby and others. And I did get a kick out of him saying it's really not that complicated. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's not complicated.
Yeah.
We expect him to be ready week 1.
Yeah. It feels like it was more complicated throughout the process of a plan in place to day, and then you really had nothing that we heard about Ja'Marr Chase. It was very unique from the start. I don't think the Bengals knew this was coming in the offseason. I don't think they were prepared for what training camp was going to be, but here we are. And the second for me that I saw him out there, all of a sudden, some of the other issues or questions we had during training camp all seemed a lot smaller when you see Ja'Marr Chase back on the practice field.
Yeah, not to cut you off there, but it is my podcast. No, seriously. I think if you get Zach Taylor in an honest moment, he'd much rather deal with this kind of problem, even though it is a distraction and he has to answer the questions, than an injury. Sure. He will take this every day of the week and twice on Sundays if it means keep Ja'Marr ready, get him ready for the season, and he'll be on board. And to me, that's the way I rate it. And I don't know if you feel the same way. But
the great and soon to be a Hall of Famer at University of Cincinnati, Marty Gilliard, would often say in 2009, do you want Marty on Tuesday or do you want Marty on Saturday?
Right.
And a lot of times it was very easy. Take your time on Tuesday. I'll see you on Saturday.
Right.
And I feel like there's some of that here with Ja'Marr Chase to make sure he gets to the season healthy, which he's going to do, barring something crazy that happens in a practice that isn't too vigorous now leading into the season. But now you're going to get Ja'Marr Chase on Sundays, and that's the ultimate goal, and that is the ultimate way for this team to reach their ceiling, which is competing for Super Bowls.
Mike Petralia, Trags here, host of the Code Reds and Jungle Boy podcasts on CLNS Media. I want to tell you about Prize Picks. It's America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. Prize Picks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. And unlike other apps, on Prize Picks, it's just you against the numbers. All you have to do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch those winnings roll in. One Caleb Williams passing yard gets you 1 win on Prize Picks every week in September. That's right, only 1 yard gets you an automatic win every football weekend in September. 4 weeks of free W's. Don't miss the deal on Prize Picks because it's gone when September ends. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as few as 4 correct picks. And Prize Picks is the only real money daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy so that your lineups stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. If your player leaves in the first half and doesn't return, your picks are still live. Download the Prize Picks app today and use the code CLNS and get $50 instantly when you play $5. That's code CLNS on Prize Picks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Prize Picks, run your game. He is Tony Pike, does an amazing job on ESPN 360 on Cincinnati's ESPN 1530, Monday through Friday, noon to 3 o'clock. You can follow him on the X at Tony_Pike15. That was his number when he was ripping it up at UC. We'll talk about your alma mater a little bit later in the podcast. I want to get your reaction, Tony, to the Bengals keeping 5 tight ends and 6 defensive tackles as part of their 53-man roster to start the season. At least as part.
Yeah.
Let me rephrase that. As part of their first 53-man roster.
Yeah, I was a little more thrown off by the 5 tight ends, but I know that this team values draft picks. I mean, every one of their 10 draft picks made the active roster. 2 undrafted free agents made the active roster. 22% of this team's draft picks from this year or players they brought in are on the 53-man roster, which is supposed to be how you build this, especially if you're going to be paying players a lot of money. You've got to start hitting on these draft picks. So I know that they value tight ends, and I know they value draft picks. This is a team, though, that for the most part is going to be playing 1 tight end sets, maybe some 2 tight end sets. So how do all these tight ends factor in? They must have liked enough of Tanner McLaughlin in the reps he got to think that there's an upside there, to probably feel like they couldn't have got him stashed away on the practice squad, that he would have ended up somewhere else based on the upside. I know they like Eric All. Drew Sample is solid. Mike Gesicki is essentially not a tight end. He's a slot receiver, and he's a good one at that. And Tanner Hudson shined last year. So I was a little thrown off by it, but when you start to break down, you can see why they did it. The defensive tackle, for me, that's been my biggest question all season. Do they have enough on the defensive line to both stop the run? They gave up almost 5 yards a carry last year. They gave up way too many explosive plays on the back end, and that's not all on the secondary. That's on the inability outside of Trey Hendrickson to get after the passer on the defensive line. So I wasn't as shocked keeping the interior defensive line because you need depth there. And I heard from Dave Lapham earlier in the week that the loss of Cam Sample is more than what people see that being, because he played so many snaps and he could fill so many different roles. I wasn't surprised at the interior. I did think it was interesting with Myles Murphy starting the season on the injured list, that they only kept 4 defensive ends, and one of those defensive ends is a rookie in Cedric Johnson. That to me is the bigger question, because ask Myles Murphy, it's hard to come into the NFL and be an effective edge rusher because the offensive line's built different. They're huge. They're athletic. You literally have, like, you have 2 or 3 go-to moves as a defensive end in college. You've got to have 7 or 8 in the NFL. You can't just rely on speed. You can't just rely on power. It's got to be a little bit of both. And I think there's a big learning curve at defensive end, specifically in the NFL. I was more surprised at Hubbard has been banged up a little bit. Hendrickson is what he is. Osai is still a little bit of an unknown, and you have a rookie, and that makes up your 4 edge rushers.
Correct.
That to me, you keep 10 overall in the defensive line. That to me was a little bit more of a question going into the season, especially with Kansas City looming in week 2.
So I do think that some of what we saw in the preseason finale, the 5-man fronts of Lou Anarumo, maybe a hint of what we might see at certain parts of the season. And certainly the reason Lou would want to put it out there in a preseason game is, can we get away with doing this? Is this an option given the lack of depth on the defensive end? I still, by the way, I still cannot imagine the Bengals going into the season with only 4 defensive edges. And
I get the Myles Murphy decision, because outside of Kansas City, there's a good chance that you're playing a rookie quarterback in week 1, because Drake Mays looked really good in New England. You're going to see a rookie quarterback in week 3 in Jaden Daniels, and the Carolina Panthers in week 4. So maybe you're thinking, okay, we can get by outside of what we know Kansas City is going to be. That's going to be a dogfight. But 3 of the first 4 opponents are not, at least yet, going to be testing you with a lot offensively. You should be able as a defense to contain those 3 teams to start the season out of those first 4 games. And maybe that's why you can get away with waiting until week 5 to get Myles Murphy back.
I think it's a great point, Tony. I happen to think that the Bengals are going to have to add eventually a 5th defensive end. I mean, I just can't see them getting away with it indefinitely.
Yeah.
The way the defensive back competition played out, we are going on the assumption that Dax Hill won that job, right? Yeah. Based on his performance. That's pretty clear. And they are keeping Josh. I'm drawing a blank here.
Josh Newton.
Josh Newton. Thank you. Josh Newton Do you think Josh Newton is going to play a significant role on the defense in the back end this year, or are they going to bring him along really slowly?
I think he can. I don't think it'll be early in the season. I still think there are highs and lows when you watch him through the preseason. And I think the highs outweigh the lows, because I do think there's huge upside with Josh Newton. I think he possesses one of the rare abilities that a corner has to have, and that's the short-term memory to respond to a negative, because you're going to get beat more times than not. Even when you are perfect in your coverage, you're just going to get beat by a better route or a better throw from a quarterback. I look at secondary as a whole, corners and safeties. I thought it was a big question mark coming in. You talk about camp battles. It wasn't like Dax Hill won by default. Dax Hill got better each and every practice. He got better each and every week, and he earned that corner number 2 role. Mike Hilton is what he is. He's as solid as they come. Now DJ Turner slides into this backup role along with Josh Newton. I think those are 2 viable backups that are going to continue to get better. And then the big part about this, we talk about camp battles. I remember at the beginning of camp talking about, is it Von Bell? Is it Jordan Battle? It was never a competition. Von Bell was the guy from the start. And Geno Stone is solid at the back end. I think having those 2 behind Cam Taylor-Britt and Dax Hill do help this team in a big way from a communication standpoint, to where last year you just saw guys running free. You saw complete misses in coverage. I don't think you're going to see as much of that this year. I think they're better up front, which we talked about. And I think they're better on the back end, which is going to give them the ability to stop some of those explosive plays that they gave up at such a high rate last year.
Mike Petraglia, Trags here, host of the Jungle Roar and Code Reds podcasts on CLNS Media. Well, there is nothing quite like the thrill and excitement of taking in a football game live and in person. Some of my favorite memories when I was growing up was when my dad would take me to a Miami of Ohio game at Miami Field or a UC game at Nippert Stadium. Well, now there's a great app that helps you get the best tickets at the best prices. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste your time searching through thousands of tickets. They have lots of great features. Curated deals make it easier to find the best prices on great seats. They have something called the Super Deal. They have seat views before you buy and lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, and job loss protection, all great features that make the Game Time app very, very unique. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code CLNS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code CLNS for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. What stood out to you about Muma Jongmeta?
One, the fact that I had to learn and deal with pronunciation again,
as we all did.
But I think while he's got a little bit of ways to go as a cover linebacker, if you turn on the tape, he reads and responds to run about as fast as you can from a linebacker. I mean, he fills gaps with authority. He fills gaps with power. I love undrafted guys because they immediately play with a chip on their shoulder. And I feel like he does. I watched one personally at the University of Cincinnati in Ivan Pace. And I watched him become one of the best linebackers in football from being undrafted for the Minnesota Vikings. He's a little undersized, but he plays a little bit like I see John Meta play. He fills so quickly. And yes, he has to evolve as a 3-down linebacker. But anytime you ask Lou Anarumo raves about him and says he's a football guy. And if you ask any defensive mind around, you get 11 football guys on the field, you're going to feel like you're in a good role. He's one of the guys
fast.
Yes.
That's the other thing. I mean, Lou wants you to there's a fine line, and you can speak to this much better than somebody who hasn't been on a football field, Tony, but there's a fine line between playing thinking and understanding what Lou wants you to do, and then once you step on the field, play fast.
It's the hardest part about the transition to the NFL, in my opinion, because quarterbacks are the same way. The more you're second guessing what you're seeing, the faster everything feels for you. And then when you start reacting and you start having more of an understanding, you start playing faster and everything else slows down. And he feels like it already has that with how fast he plays. He's a guy, linebacker for me, I know at starter what they had. Linebacker going into camp was a question not a lot of people were talking about because I don't know that there was a lot of depth built in. And all of a sudden, he makes you feel a little better with Joe Bachie, with Akeem Davis-Gaither. Now you feel like you have a little depth. And I'm sure Darren Simmons was very happy to see Muma Meta make the roster because he's an immediate special teams guy. And I think as the season progresses, as he develops, I think he can help this defense at some point this season.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how many reps he gets. If there are moments where either Jermaine Pratt or obviously Logan Wilson, if either of those guys need a blow, is it going to be Akeem Davis-Gaither? I mean, there's an assumption that Akeem has been around longer. You just plug him in, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe Muma gets a chance.
Yeah, I think the depth question was answered at all three levels of training camp. There was depth on the defensive line that had to be better. There was depth in the secondary and at linebacker. And I think coming out of camp, when you look at the 53-man, I think all of those issues were at least answered on paper going into the start of the regular season.
You know, it has to be better this year for the 2024 Cincinnati Bengals. What did you say?
Offensive line?
No, that's not where I was going. Punting.
Special teams? Yes.
Punting, absolutely unqualified, has to be better than it was last year. And I'm fascinated to see how Ryan Rico, given the quadriceps injury, we finally found out on cutdown day what the specific injury was with Brad Robbins. With that quadriceps injury, how does Ryan Rico take this job, run with it? And we saw quite a few boomers in the last two games from Rico. He's got the leg. It's consistency, and we saw two touchbacks, and we don't want to see that if you're Darren Simmons. But I think Rico has got the leg to stick around if he takes advantage.
Yeah, I feel like the consistency is the question.
Yep.
And I feel like if you ask Darren Simmons, would you rather have 70-yard punts and short ones mixed in, or just consistent 50-yard punts? He would probably say consistency, because the inconsistencies have cost this team in recent years. They've cost this team against Kansas City in recent years. And you want to talk about derailing a season, derailing momentum. The start of this season is so important. You want to let Carolina or Washington or New England hang around, give up a big return, or give up a return touchdown on a punt or something like that. I agree. I think Rico, I think he's got a stronger leg, but he's just been so inconsistent. I mean, there's been times where he hits the ball off the side of his foot for 25 yards at practice.
We've seen it in practice.
And that can be devastating. So I'm very interested to see, because all of this happens, and it's like, is there a move still to be had out there? When all is said and done, is Darren Simmons content and good to go in, at least for the first 4 weeks, with a punter with a huge upside, but also a punter that possesses some inconsistencies as well at that position.
And he's done the holding job for Evan McPherson very well in the preseason games. I'm not a pro. Okay. I'm not Darren Simmons, but I haven't seen any noticeable drop-offs. And McPherson did hit a couple of 50-plus yard field goals in the preseason. That is the Cincinnati Bengals portion of the Jungle Roar podcast this week. Trags, Mike Petralia here, host of the Jungle Roar podcast on CLNS Media. Well, there's no doubt about it. We've had our fair share of hot, humid, hazy days this summer. And the last thing I want to do on a hot, humid day is worrying about preparing a meal. Well, there's an answer for that. Fuel up for them with Factor's no prep, no mess meals. Meet your wellness goals in time for summer thanks to the menu of chef-crafted meals with options like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. So no matter how busy you are, you'll always have time to enjoy nutritious, great tasting meals. Make today the day you kickstart a new healthy routine. What are you waiting for? With 35 different meals and more than 60 add-ons to choose from every week, you'll always have new flavors to explore. Crush your wellness goals this month with dietitian-approved meals and ingredients that you can trust. Make your day delicious from breakfast to dessert. Stay fueled with easy, nutritious options. Head over to factormeals.com/Bengals50 and use code Bengals50. That's BENGALS50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off next month. That's code Bengals50 at factormeals.com/Bengals50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active. I want to get to your alma mater. Opens with the Towson Wildcats this Saturday at Nippert Stadium. Your expectations for a team coming off a shockingly poor 3-9 year last year, and what your expectations are for Scott Satterfield, head coach, Brendan Sorsby, the transfer quarterback from Indiana, and a guy that I loved watching run last year, Corey Kiner.
Yeah, I mean, for Scott Satterfield and the team, to me, the minimum is 6 wins. Getting to a bowl game this year is a must for the Cincinnati Bearcats. One, they have 46 new scholarship players that are on this roster. Now, it's different in college football now because, you know, it's like adding a bunch of new guys into this melting pot. And yes, they may be talented, but can they all be talented and work together? I think is a huge question mark. You know, what do you have in the secondary? They have to be better. Dante Corleone is still an unknown because of the blood clots. They lose 2 defensive linemen during training camp that were projected to be starters. So they are a little undermanned on the defensive side. I love Tyson Veit. I love the new defensive coordinator. I think he's going to bring some very unique stuff to the University of Cincinnati from Iowa State.
Unique in what sense, Tony?
3-3-5. It's just different. You don't see it as much in college football with 3 down linemen, 3 backers, and 5 in the secondary. I think that's one to help how bad the secondary was. And I think it does help if you do get Dante Corleone back, who can plug up the middle. You just don't see a lot of their style that they're going to play with on the defensive side of the ball. So I think they'll be better defensively. But what I'm excited about, I don't know if people realize, I know they didn't win a lot of games last year. They were the 5th best rushing team in the nation. And they return all 5 starting offensive linemen and a 1,000-yard rusher in Corey Kiner. You should be one of the best rushing teams in the nation. Scott Satterfield's offense plays into that. He's one of the only coaches from an offensive side that I think for 4 years now has averaged both 200 rushing and passing every single game. No one else does that. He's the only guy. And I think when you see what the rushing attack can be, you bring back Xavier Henderson, your best pass-catching receiver, and then you go get Joe Royer from Ohio State out of Elder High School. I think Royer could have started at Ohio State this year. He comes back to Cincinnati as a tight end. Dan Horde, the voice of the Bearcats, says that his thought right now is Joe Royer is the next list or the next on the list of tight ends at the University of Cincinnati. So if you can run the ball well, and they should be able to, if you've got an elite tight end, which they should have, if you've got pass catching options, you should be able to get a lot of one-on-one matchups. And last year, Emory Jones struggled at that. They go out and get Brendan Sorsby, and from all accounts, he's made plays downfield. He can make plays with his legs, but he's been connecting on those down-the-field threats. A quarterback's best friend is a rushing attack.
Yes.
Because they have to load the box, and if you do that, you get one-on-one matchups, you get favorable play-action matchups, you get an offensive line that can protect. They should be able to score points offensively. Their schedule is not strong. They play one ranked Big 12 team preseason on the schedule. They open up with Towson, Pittsburgh, winnable at home. They go to Miami, and then they face one of the worst teams in the Big 12, and that's Houston.
They beat on the road last year for their only Big 12 win.
I legitimately think this team can start 4-0. And what happens after that, I don't know. I think the season last year is different. If they find a way to beat Miami at home, the season's different.
Correct. We talked about that in the crossover the last time I filled in for Mo. And that one loss, that overtime loss, changed the entire complexion of the season, and really, I thought did a lot of damage is a strong word, but it really impacted Scott Satterfield, and I think the way he wanted to communicate to his team.
I'm bullish. I'm bullish. I think 5.5 is low because of what they return offensively and what they've added offensively. I think this is going to be a very good offensive team. Now, can they stop the run because they've had so much loss on the front end? And if you can't stop the run, you set yourself up to be even more vulnerable on the back end. I do think that they're going to give up some points. But with a new defensive coordinator, you still got Kerry Combs out there who's just as adamant and animated as ever. You've got not one but two Fletchers at punter, Mason and Max. His brother came over from Arkansas. He's an All-American candidate. He's a Ray guy. I mean, they've got the special teams. They have the talent up front offensively.
You haven't always been able to say that, by the way. What you just said, I don't know when the last time.
Yes.
Rich Carlis in 1978. I don't know. We haven't always been able to say they have the special teams.
I'm bullish. I think this team is going to surprise people. I think they're going to be better than what a lot of people are expecting them to be. And that's why I'm setting the bar at 6. That's my minimum. If it's not 6, then there has to be some serious conversations that happen after the Cincinnati Bearcats season, because you can't afford, as you're going in and embarking now on the Big 12, you can't afford to be relegated as just the afterthought. You can't afford to just be out of sight, out of mind, and projected to finish near the bottom of the Big 12 every year. You have to reassert yourself and say, okay, 2021-22 season, this team represented in the college football playoff as one of the 4 best teams in the country. That's a short time ago. You cannot have that big of a fall off in that short amount of time. You've got to get back to a minimum 6, get to a bowl game, build off that this year if you're Scott Satterfield and the Bearcats.
There is no question that Cincinnati in the fall is a lot better, not only when the Bengals are doing well, obviously, but when the Bearcats are doing well. And we got to enjoy both in 2021, the Bengals run to the Super Bowl, the Bearcats run to the national championship semifinal. It was a magical time in Cincinnati. And there's no doubt that if you're a football fan in Cincinnati and a fan of Cincinnati football, you want both programs to do well. And I appreciate you giving your 2 cents on that, Tony.
Absolutely.
All right. Tony Pike does a terrific job, highly entertaining most of all.
Most days.
On ESPN.
Football seasons here.
Yes, aren't we all? ESPN 360. If you're watching this on video, you can see the signage behind him. It helps me too. ESPN 360 with Tony Pike on Cincinnati's ESPN 1530. Follow him on the X at Tony_Pike15. His number when he was ripping it up in Clifton as the quarterback of the Cincinnati Bearcats. Tony, I want to thank you very much for joining me. I want to thank our great sponsors, our partners here on the Jungle Roar Pod, Prize Picks, Game Time, and new this week, Factor Meals. He is Tony Pike. My name is Mike Petralia. Thanks for downloading and consuming this episode of the Jungle Roar Podcast. Until next week, keep that jungle roaring.